I'd like to welcome you all to History at Home by the Montclair History Center, and I am Jane Eliasoff. I am thankful to everybody for all of the wonderful feedback we've been getting on these programs. One of the wonderful things too is that people are actually sending me notes now and saying, hey, I'd like to be able to talk on this or that, or you should have somebody talk on this or that. And so we love that kind of information. We also love it if you have a couple of extra dollars and are willing to donate to us. We're just, trying to do the best we can during these weird times. You can do it either of three ways. You can send a check to 108 Orange Road, Montclair, New Jersey, 07042. We're on Venmo. All you have to do is look up Montclair History Center and my name will pop up, but that's the right place. And finally, what am I missing? On our website, you can actually go onto our website and either join as a member. We love members, or you can simply donate there. And we appreciate really anything anybody can do for us. So with that, I'm going to now introduce Rita Williams-Bogar, who is with Rosedale Cemetery. She's been a wonderful fan and resource to us. And Rita has come on every single program we've done, whether it be live or virtual. So Rita, would you like to say a couple of things?
Sure. So thank you very much, Jane. And thank you, Erin. I'm always excited for the tours, virtual or otherwise. So as Jane mentioned, I'm Rita Williams-Bogar. I serve on the board of managers at Rosedale, and one of my committees is the outreach committee, so it works out perfectly. Thank you all for your interest in Rosedale and learning about the history of the cemetery that just turned 180 years old this summer. July 15th, 1840 is the formation or the foundation date. And we've enjoyed this tour. Old section, new section. I'm thinking it's about 5 years now, Jane, 5 or 6 years now that we've been doing this. And in addition to the tours, a couple of the services I'm very proud of is we were webcasting before there was a pandemic. So families would use our chapel and we would webcast the services, even within the state of New Jersey, if somebody couldn't travel. A lot of times webcasting outside of the country as well. And we won first runner-up by American Cemetery Magazine for cemetery excellence. So we're very proud of our customer service, the way we maintain the grounds, etc. So with that, I don't want to take too much time from Erin's presentation because it's great, and I'm here for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Rita. Erin, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Erin Benz and welcome her greatest fan, her mother, who's on the phone tonight. And Erin has been with us now for 2 years, but she has also volunteered and interned with us before that. She is an amazing addition to our staff, and we love Erin. And Erin, take it away.
All right, well, thank you. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you. So as Jane mentioned, I've been here for about 2 years. I've been running the tours, the in-person tours with Jane for about that long. So back in June, initially, we usually have a spring and a fall in-person tour of Rosedale. The spring is of the new section, the fall is of the old section. We unfortunately did miss out on the in-person in spring, so that's when we said, hey, why don't we just turn it into something virtual for people to check out instead? So back in, I think, June, we did the new section virtually, which is what you can check out on YouTube. So then we thought, let's do the same thing for the fall with the old section. So that's where we're here. So without further ado, I'm going to hop right into it. I'm going to share my screen here. Captions on. All right. Well, welcome to History at Home, Rosedale Cemetery Old Section Edition. So like I mentioned, we do a fall tour. So this is just the highlights of that in-person tour that we normally give. It's going to be include a combination of interesting people, interesting stones, and also just a quick overview of the history of cemeteries in New Jersey. So we're going to jump right into it. So first off, just kind of a quick overview of the history of cemeteries. So of course, they start in the churchyard and family burial plots as well. But as the population exploded, inevitably, this placed a huge strain on the limited space in church burial grounds. You couple that with an increasingly health-conscious society that had little knowledge. These overcrowded cemeteries were often looked at as the culprits of disease and, you know, that kind of the bad cholera epidemics and all that good stuff, they started to be blamed for that. So one great example is Trinity Church in Manhattan. That you could smell the decomposing bodies just as you walked by the church. You didn't even have to go into the grounds, and you could smell it. Jane and I like to think that maybe this is where the game of holding your breath as you walked past a cemetery began. I don't know if you've ever played that game when you were a kid. Either when you were driving by in a car, or if you were walking by, you would try to hold your breath until you pass the graveyard. And we think maybe that's when it started, when the really bad smells were then you didn't want to breathe it in. We don't have any proof of that, but we like to think maybe that's where it started. Some forward-thinking citizens began to design new burial grounds at this point, not under the auspices of the church, but with a board of trustees. It became a quasi-business at this point. To lend legitimacy to these cemeteries, prominent citizens would often sit on the board. So at Rosedale, if you know your Montclair history, you know the Dodd family was quite prominent in town, and there was a Dodd sitting on the board of Rosedale. So to add that bit of legitimacy to the new cemeteries. So this burial reform eventually led to the rural cemetery movement. This movement was aiming to make a more tidy cemetery than the churchyard. So they were putting in a grid system, serpentine roads, secondary paths that were often named after something natural like plants. Also landscaping, trees, shrubbery, all that very nice additions. So there would be more family plots than individual gravestones here. By 1844, there were several cemetery companies in New Jersey, Rosedale being among them. As Rita mentioned, they were founded in about 1840. And this is from the Rosedale website. So initially, Rosedale was named the Orange Cemetery Company, and the website says, others like the Orange Cemetery Company were laid out on rolling terrain with a gated entrance, landscaped grounds, walks, and a variety of trees, shrubbery, and evergreens. So it sounds quite lovely to be in. And then just a fun fact, in Essex County, the cost for digging a grave was between $1.50 and $7 in the years between 1828 and 1830. So eventually, the rural cemeteries began to look haphazard, plus the towns that they had originally been set away from were now encroaching on them. So they were looking for a better way to maintain these cemeteries and a better way to have maintenance there as well. So this led to the lawn park cemetery movement. This began about after the Civil War. It was very landscape driven, maintained by the cemetery, not by the families. There were fewer secondary paths. There was a more open pastoral setting. There's often no family plot enclosures, and preferred one family monument over smaller individual monuments. So going into Rosedale specifically, prior to Rosedale's establishment, bodies would have been buried at the old burying ground at First Presbyterian Church of Orange, which is located on Main Street and Scotland Road. As we mentioned, Rosedale was created in 1840. There were reinterments from the old burying ground to Rosedale up until 1859. In 1844, the name changed from Orange Cemetery to Rosedale Cemetery. And around 1869, more land was added and a new entrance was created, which you can see in the picture there. They also have cremations occurring too. And then I just want to show you real quick. So this is the 1906 atlas. This shows Rosedale Cemetery at that time. You can very clearly see the distinctions. The old section is the bottom left corner, that plot of land there. You can see the idea of grid systems, secondary serpentine paths, but you also see how the town around it was started to encroach on that area. Some of the graves are mere feet from people's backyards, from the street, from businesses. So it gets quite tight there. So that's when the new section, which is in the top right corner of your screen, that's the new section. You can see where we're talking about the lawn park cemetery movement, where it's more pastoral setting, a lot more open space. It's, they're preventing the encroaching on other people's land. So you kind of get that sense there. You also see in the old section, yes, there was a pond there. It is no longer there. If you go to visit the old section, you can kind of see where it would have been. And there are graves there now, so it's not like a clear, just blank piece of land, but you can kind of see the imprint of where the pond would have been. And then just another great example of, you know, this being a very rural lawn park kind of cemetery. When I went to go visit a couple months ago, I found this lovely little fawn just sitting right next to this grave here. So it's just a great example of how this really does have this rural feel and natural feel to the cemetery there. And this is the columbarium at Rosedale. So this is where if you have a loved one's ashes, they decide to be cremated instead of buried, you can have their ashes placed here instead. If you don't want to take them home, you can always have them interred here instead. So it's a lovely place, beautiful place. You can always check it out. But we're going to skip right into the people right now. So first off, we're going to start with Reverend Asa Hillyer. He's very appropriate to start with, as he was one of the first burials in Rosedale. He was the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Orange, which is where that old burying ground was. And he was the pastor from 1801 to 1838. Most of the burials before Rosedale would have been at the church. So him being buried at Rosedale was a statement that it was okay to be buried away from the church. He died in 1840 and was eventually moved to Rosedale in 1841. So right smack when Rosedale was starting. Little background on Asa. He was born in Sheffield, Massachusetts, graduated from Yale in 1786, and he was pastor at Bottle Hill in Morris County for 12 years before coming to Orange. Real quick, so this is the First Presbyterian Church that I was talking about with the old burying ground, which you can see in the foreground there. And then this would have been Asa Hillyer's house. This was located at the corner of Main and Hillyer Streets. And while the writing at the bottom of it looks backwards, we did confirm that the photo itself is the correct layout. So that is what the house looks like. It's not flipped around. This photo came from the Library of Congress. It was taken in the 1930s as part of a WPA project. Not sure how the Library of Congress messed that one up, but I'm not going to blame them for that. So a little bit about the stone itself. As you can tell, it is an obelisk. We're going to come across a lot of obelisks today. And I just wanted to delve into why obelisks are so popular in graveyards, especially graveyards from this time. This is from some of my research. The obelisk is one of the most pervasive of all revival forms of cemetery art. There's hardly a cemetery found in the 1840s and 50s without some form of Egyptian influence in the public buildings, gates, tomb art, etc. Napoleon's 1798 to 99 Egyptian campaigns, the discoveries of the tombs of the pharaohs, and the recent founding of the United States, and our need to borrow the best of ancient cultures, Greek revival, classic revival, the prominence of classical studies and dress, led to a resurgence of interest in the ancient Egyptian culture. Obelisks were considered to be tasteful, with pure uplifting lines associated with ancient greatness, patriotic, able to be used in relatively small spaces, and perhaps most importantly, obelisks were less costly than large and elaborate sculpted monuments. So that's why they were quite prominent at this time. Also, the around 1840s and 50s is when you start to see railroads being established, and the railroads allowed the granite from New England to be shipped down to the mid-Atlantic states. So that's why you also see a resurgence, interest in obelisks in graveyards at this time. So next I want to mention Ruth Ogden Pearson, fascinating woman buried here in Rosedale. Her parents were missionaries. She was actually born in Tianjin, China, and I apologize if I mispronounced that. So you can see that's the little red area on the map there. She was born in China in 1885. She's noted as a bacteriologist, which was unusual for a woman at that time, and she ended up never marrying either. She attended Wellesley College, graduating in 1908. We believe she began her career with the Rhode Island State Board of Health right after that, from 1908 to 1909. In the 1910 census, she's listed as a bacteriologist for the City Board in Massachusetts, having attended MIT in 1910. Also quite unusual for a woman at that time. So she's a researcher out in a lab in California and served as the director of the Red Cross Laboratory in Ohio. She's also making her way all across the United States at this time. So she's traveling quite a bit. In both the 1930 and 1940 census, she's finally listed as a lodger in East Orange as a bacteriologist for the City Board of Health. She was also a member of the American Public Health Academy, and she's buried here with her parents and brothers. So just a fascinating woman, breaking barriers just 100 years ago, buried right here in Rosedale. Next, we're going back to another reverend here. This time, we're going to look more at this guy's grave more than the family itself. So as you can tell, it's another obelisk-shaped structure. However, this one is not made of stone. It's actually made of zinc, or what they called back then white bronze. This white bronze was made in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and was manufactured between the 1870s and about 1912. And it was sold through a catalog with customizable pieces as well. So very similar kind of to like a Sears house, a Sears catalog house that you could get. One thing that's interesting about the grave is that it has extensive genealogical information. It shows where Reverend Thomas Smith was born, which is not very common. Sometimes you might get a death date, you might get a birth date, you might not get either. You might get only one or the other. So the fact that it has both birth and death date, and it has where he was born and where he died, it's fantastic for genealogists and researchers. So a nice little gem there. He is buried here with his two wives. His first wife was Mariah. We believe she probably died quite young in childbirth. And his second wife was Amanda, who you see at the bottom of the screen there. Now, his grave also has a lot of imagery on it. As you can see here, there's a little wheat bundle there, and I'm going to zoom in on those in just a second. So the wheat bundle, what does it mean? Well, the wheat bundle represented kind of a life, a long-lived life, and it represents the divine harvest. There's also on this grave a man leaning on a cross. Now there's variations of man leaning on a cross, person leaning on a cross. Could be as simple as literally just a shoulder on a cross, maybe just even touching the cross. But in this case, they're literally holding onto the cross as if it's holding them up. And so this represents unwavering faith. This specific imagery is also very common on Masonic graves. I do not know if Reverend Thomas was a Mason, but it's possible. And if you see this on other graves in a cemetery, it might mean they were also Masons. Next, we've got the open book. Of course, it's the Bible, so that represents faith as well. But an open book also represents passage of one existence to another. And finally, we've got the rose. The rose itself represents wisdom and love, whereas a rose bud represents a life cut too short. So in this case, the bud probably represents Mariah, having died quite young. All right, and then real quick, I just want to show, so when you knock on a zinc tomb, it has a kind of distinct sound that you can tell it's zinc. So I just want to play that real quick. It's kind of got that distinct hollow sound. So that's how you know you've got a zinc or a white bronze gravestone there. All right, next we've got the Williams family. Now again, we're kind of looking more what the stories tell about this family. So taking a look at the names, I'm gonna zoom in here real quick. There's a lot of names, there's a lot of dates, and if you take a close look at the dates, a fair number of these dates are a little too close together. There's a lot of members of this family that died young. And we know the reasons for that, actually. We know that between 1834 and 1835, there was a cholera epidemic, and you can see those dates on the stone there. And same with 1857 and 1858, there was a flu outbreak at that time, and you see those dates on there as well. So we know that that's the reason those members died quite young, or even if they lived a fairly full life, that might have been a reason for their death as well. Now, going back real quick, you can see there's the family crest there, which I'm going to zoom in. It is the Lowell family crest. I'm not going to pronounce the Latin, but I do know it says, know your opportunity. The Lowells believed that their opportunity was the New World. It began with the patriarch Percival Lowell, who was living in England at the time, and at the ripe old age of 68, decided that his future was in the New World. So he moved his whole family over, and this was about 1639, so quite early on, before really America was even, any semblance of what it is, what it was known to be. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the Lowells were widely considered to be one of America's most accomplished families, and among them included Tennessee Williams, Herman Melville, and T.S. Eliot. So the Williams family here doesn't appear to be very affluent or influential, but they were still claiming that relationship to that respected family with the large crest. So they still wanted to establish that connection there. All right, next we're going to talk about a Winthrop Dodd Mitchell. So first, our first Dodd of the day. So this one, again, we're kind of focusing on the stone. This kind of stone is actually called a hip sarcophagus. Bit of a misnomer. It's not really a sarcophagus. The body is still buried in the ground, and the stone's just laying on top. And the hip sarcophagus just resembles a low slung house in shape. This one just happens to incorporate a cross shape on the top. It's more of a style feature. There's not really much symbolism with this. However, it does kind of look like the roof of a church if you were to stand above it there. So, excuse me. So that was kind of a cool little feature there. A little family background on the Mitchells. They were New Jersey rooted and born family. Dodd, of course, as I mentioned, very prominent family in Montclair. Winthrop's father, Erin Mitchell, descended from the Peck family, which settled in Orange in 1614, another one of those old New Jersey families. He was a member of the Essex County Medical Society and Orange Mountain Medical Society. Served in a few hospitals as surgical staff and had private practice. Spent a majority of his years in St. Michael's, Newark, and as health officer of East Orange, New Jersey. In the 1900 census, he's listed as a doctor, and he has one Irish and one Black servant living with him at the time. So they're quite well off at this time too. And another cool feature of the stone is that instead of writing the names right on top or having a separate stone for the names, they just incorporate the names into the side of the stone. It doesn't break away from the structure, doesn't interrupt it at all. It's nice, kind of hidden on the side there that you can see in the photo on the right. Next, another Dodd, of course. We got to have more Dodds here. So this one is Captain Samuel Dodd. He was a Civil War Union Army officer, and he died in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. He was commissioned as captain and commander of Company H, 26th New Jersey Volunteer Infantry on September 2nd, 1862. He led his troops through the December 62 Battle of Fredericksburg and the May 63 Battle of Chancellorsville. On July 5th, 1863, he led a portion of his men across the Rappahannock River at Franklin's Crossing, Virginia, for the purpose of silencing skirmishing Confederate troops there. The action was successful in capturing a number of rebel soldiers in the clearing of some rifle pits, but in the ensuing return, Captain Dodd was mortally wounded and died the next day. So the photo on the right is the photo I took just recently of his grave, and the photo on the left is the same grave, different angle, and it's the sons of Civil War veterans sitting at Dodd's grave. This photo actually came to us by somebody who attended one of our Rosedale tours a couple years ago. She took a scan of the photo, sent it to us, so unfortunately I don't have the exact year of the photo, but I thought that was very cool that you can tell it's the same stone. It's just about 100 years or maybe even a lot later, or excuse me, a lot earlier than that. So kind of a cool little bit there. Next is Lowell Mason. He was born in Medfield, Massachusetts in 1792, and he died in 1872. He's known as the founder of American School Music Education and co-founder of the Boston Academy of Music. He was a religious musical composer and was a leading figure and prolific writer of American church music, having composed the tunes to over 1,600 hymns, including the well-known hymns Nearer My God to Thee, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, and Joy to the World. I want to play a quick clip of Nearer My God to Thee, just so you can kind of get an idea of his music style. Just a real quick clip there. If you're interested in hearing more, you can find that exact video on YouTube later tonight. That song, Near My God to Thee, was actually what was allegedly played by the band on the Titanic as it sunk. So a little fact there for you. Lowell was also credited with setting the music to the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb. I assumed you all knew that one, so I didn't bother putting the music in here. If we take a look at the plot itself, it's an enclosed plot there. That's the Mason family plot. We're going to zoom in on the centerpiece here. So you can see Mason clearly written out. Lowell's name is actually on that stone as well. And if we take an even closer look at that center there, it looks like something's missing. We believe that that space would have held a photo of some sort. That's why the holes are there. Over time, it may have just fallen off, or maybe it was stolen. We're not sure. But we believe a photo, maybe of Lowell, of the family, of something else, would have been held there at some point. Now, also in the Lowell Mason and the Mason family plot is George James Webb. No family ties at all to the Masons, other than he and Lowell co-founded the Boston Academy of Music together. So they must have been extremely close for George to be buried in the plot. He's buried right behind that centerpiece we were looking at before. So George Webb was born in 1803, died 1887. Like Lowell, he was a composer and a hymn writer. He was born near Salisbury in Wiltshire, England, and emigrated to Boston in 1830, where he played the organ at the Old South Church for almost 40 years. Together with Lowell, he founded the Boston Academy of Music and composed several choral and organ works, such as Prelude in E-flat and Postlude in A. He's best known for writing the hymns titled the Webb Tune Book, which included "'Tis Dawn, the Lark is Singing," a parlor song that was used in a musical show and on ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean. This song actually has a gory story associated with it. The tune was repurposed for the hymn Stand Up for Jesus." The story goes that in 1858, shortly after preaching at a hugely successful mission in Philadelphia, the evangelist and abolitionist Dudley Atkins Tying visited a barn on his farm. Stretching out to pat a mule that was working a machine shelling corn, his sleeve caught in the cogs and tore off his arm. Hours later, he was discovered slowly bleeding to death. In his last moments, he whispered to one of his assistants, George Duffield, "Tell them to stand up for Jesus." Duffield went sadly home and wrote the hymn as a tribute, which he read out as part of his next sermon. It was printed in a Sunday school newspaper and soon caught on to the point that it was sung on both sides of the ensuing Civil War. So I just want to play a quick clip of this as well. So just a little clip there. If that sounds familiar to you, maybe you sung it Sunday school when you were a kid, maybe heard it somewhere else. So I know during my noon talk, we had a couple of people that said, "Oh my gosh, yeah, I sang this in kindergarten and stuff." So definitely a familiar tune, I'm sure, to some of you. So despite George and Lowell both making their careers in Boston, they both ended up in Orange, George dying in Orange in 1887. So that's how they ended up here. Next is Anthony Thompson. He is a fascinating figure, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on him. He was born in 1798, enslaved to George Doria in Somerset County. Doria was a pastor in the local Dutch Reformed Church. Anthony and his mother were sold when he was just 1 year old to David Still, also of Somerset, who kept them only for 1 year before selling them to Samuel Ward, who lived right outside the cemetery on a 60 to 70 acre farm. When Samuel died in 1822, he manumitted or set free Anthony, who was valued at $200. He did not set free Anthony's mother, Dinah, who was 60 years old at the time and considered unable to support herself. She was considered, if she was set free, she would have been considered a burden on society. She was sold to the highest bidder then instead. Anthony was able to purchase her, luckily, thanks to some townsfolk that helped him raise the money. And together, he and his mother lived in West Orange until she passed away between 1840 and 1850. Anthony went on to work for the Williams family in West Orange, and he was able to finally purchase his own home, and he actually married twice. His first wife was Priscilla Conover, and his second wife was Harriet. He ended up living a long and full life, well respected in the community, with census data identifying him as a farm laborer. Now I have a little clip in the top right corner there. That is a little clipping from a New York Times article from 1882, where the author interviews both Anthony and another former enslaved worker, Betsy Berry, who he claims are the last living former enslaved workers living in Essex County in about 1882. I just want to read a couple quotes from this article. Both Anthony and Betsy, in their own words, describe their experience as enslaved workers. So I just want to read what both of them had to say. So first off, Anthony starts with, "I never saw a slave whipped in New Jersey unless he deserved it. But I heard of some cruelty up in the Dutch settlements around Quackendock, which is present-day Passaic, Essex, and suburban counties. And in Stonehouse Plains, which is present-day Bloomfield. I was kindly treated, and so far as I know, all the slaves in Essex County had kind masters. Everybody went to the first church in Orange, which is the first Presbyterian church that we mentioned at the beginning with the old burying ground and that Asa Hillyer was reverend at, where the slaves were boxed up in one corner like horses in a stall. In the new first church, the slaves had a place in the gallery." And then I want to read a bit of Betsy's experience, which differs quite a lot from Anthony's. So Betsy says, "Folks as had slaves here in New Jersey was just as cruel as the folks in the South. In every place there's good and bad folks, and there was good and bad masters and misses in New Jersey." She goes on to describe her former master, Henry Jacobus. "He was good to me sometimes, but the rest of the family cuffed me about. I'd known slaves as was whipped so bad by the old Dutch farmers that they died, and one man named Still had to bury his dead slave under the barn. I was small when I seen women whipped with bunches of twigs until the blood ran in streams, and they afterwards showed me their backs all covered with cuts and black welts. Nobody can't tell me that slaves wasn't whipped in them days, and nobody can't scarcely believe how bad and cruel some masters was in them days." Now, Betsy describes a vastly different experience from Anthony. Anthony almost seems to think that enslaved workers were treated very well in his area, only being whipped when they, quote, deserved it, in his words. Whereas Betsy was seeing a lot more violence. Part of the reason could have been that Anthony was owned by English masters, whereas Betsy was owned by Dutch masters. And Anthony even says that he heard that the Dutch masters were more violent than the English ones. So that's quite possibly why he had a very different experience from Betsy. But we like to share their stories because they give us a first-hand account of enslaved life here in New Jersey. First off, when we tell their stories, we tell them on one of our tours at the Crane House and Historic YWCA, we tell their stories. And first off, some people are just surprised that there even was slavery here in New Jersey. They think that's a Southern issue. They thought that, that was only in the South, but it really happened up here in the North as well. They also are surprised that slavery was not idyllic up here. They were not happier up here than they were in the South. Betsy makes the direct comparison that the enslaved workers here in New Jersey were treated just as badly as the ones in the South. So it's important to share these stories because they've been forgotten over time. So we like to share those stories as well. Now, luckily, these stories are being shared even more recently as September, because actually in West Orange, a plaque for Anthony Thompson was erected thanks to Joseph Fagan and I believe the Historical Society of West Orange. Literally towards the end of September is when this was put up. It's at Torrey Corner. You can go check it out if you'd like. So we're very happy that this was erected, further telling Anthony's story here in Essex County. Now, slight shift in tone here. Now we're going to talk about John and Anna Connah, and again, focusing more on their grave here, which is this beautifully sculpted, perfect sphere. This circular shape is really just decorative. It's supposed to denote wealth, as it was very difficult to get this perfect sphere shape, much more difficult than just carving an obelisk or on a regular tombstone. And so if there were 3 or more of these circles, they would have been recognized as a symbol of gifts or money, so such as St. Nicholas. But in this case, really just saying how rich the Connahs were. Anna and John are both buried here. Anna was born in 1839 and died in 1915. And John was born in 1831 and died in 1876. So she ended up living quite a bit longer than John. According to the 1870 census, they definitely had a few servants and quite a large value of worth for their real estate up in New York at the time, which was valued at $100,000 then. In today's money, it's about $2 million. Also, according to the census, they have a governess, a nurse, plus a few servants. So they were quite well off at this time. Now, there's a very similar stone over in Ohio called the Merchant Sphere. The Merchant family in Ohio was were prominent industrialists, and when they erected this massive sphere in 1896 to mark the grave of Charles Merchant, it matched the style and fortitude of the clan. For my research, I read the great granite ball was placed atop a stone plinth and polished and stained to a fine shine, except for the circle where the ball rested on its stand. Within a few years of its installation, the sphere had mysteriously begun to slowly rotate on its pedestal, eventually revealing the bald spot. The estimated 5,200-pound ball had not been secured to the base, thinking the huge amount of friction would simply have held it in place. At one point, the Merchant descendants attempted to right the sphere, securing it with tar. Despite this, the stone has managed to continue to spin on its pedestal, with no one quite sure why, be it from imperceptible vibration or ghostly intervention of some, as some would have it. But no matter the case, the Merchant ball rolls on. So, a little fun story there. Next, we're looking at a section that even if you've been to the Rosedale Old section, you may have missed. It's the Chinese section in the Rosedale section, in the Rosedale Cemetery. So I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese funerary traditions. Members of grieving families will burn joss paper, J-O-S-S, also known as ghost money, to ensure safe passage of the deceased into the afterlife. Apart from joss paper, other miniature items such as houses, cars, televisions, utensils are also burned. It's believed that all these enter the afterlife with the deceased so that he or she can leave a luxurious and comfortable life even after death. Here's a photo of some of that joss paper. And yes, those beautifully tailored suits in the bottom there, that is all made of paper and it's all made to be burned in these kind of ceremonies. I was watching a program on Netflix where somebody visited a joss paper store and he bought a full-sized paper moped that he went on to burn in one of these ceremonies. So you can really find almost anything you can think of that can be made into joss paper to burn so that your loved one can bring it into their afterlife. In the spring, that's the Chinese Buddhists' tomb sweeping day. People visit the graves, burn paper money or other objects, and leave food such as oranges. So if you happen to be in the Rosedale Old section in the spring, you might see some of these ceremonies and traditions happening right there. Next to another set of old graves, these are actually right next to the Chinese section, across from them. These old graves were removed from Second Presby in Newark at 17 Washington Street, the Newark Burial Ground on Plain Street. These graves are great examples of the imagery evolution on graves. So we're going to start first with the death's head here. So the death's head was a shift from the harsher skull and crossbones beginning in the 17th century that tried to soften the image of the head, for example, wings, which you can see there. But heavily so towards the 18th century was more a human-like face, although vacant stare rather than a skull. And you can kind of see the human-like face there, really plump cheeks almost, but kind of the vacant stare on that stone there. Similarly with sayings, "Here lies the body of," or "Here lies the mortal remains of," referring to the attitude of the Puritans at the time that people lived and now they're dead, period. As the shift of going to another realm after death was possible, the images and sayings would soften. Over time, this vacant stare would shift from having more human features and emotions in the carvings for interpretation. By the mid-19th century of the rural cemetery movement, so this is around the time Rosedale was founded, the death's head would start to be replaced by winged cherubs, and sayings like "Here lies the body of" would be replaced with sayings more like "Gone but not forgotten." Some other imagery you'll see on these old graves are the flame, which represents everlasting life. The bud leaf, which we mentioned before, represents life cut too short in the case it is a child that died young. And the willow tree, which represents mortality and mourning. Now something very different, Charles Fulham McKim. Now taking a look at the family plot, which is that bottom photo there, you can tell that an architect planned the plot in terms of visual and space usage of a visitor in mind. You can imagine walking right in there, putting a blanket down, having a picnic with your deceased loved ones perfectly there. Charles Full McKim was a very prominent architect. He was born in 1847 and died in 1909. There's his name on the plot. And when you walk in, the names are all etched on the inside. So his name is located there. So some of his best known works include the Morgan Library, the University Club of New York building, and New York Penn Station, which was unfortunately demolished in 1964, and which unfortunately McKim actually died a year before the station opened, so we never got to see his completed work. He also designed the Newport Casino in Rhode Island and the Boston Public Library, which from 1882 to 1893 was the largest public library in America. A little bit more closer to home, he also designed 66 South Fullerton here in Montclair. The photo on the left is of the house in about 1880, and the photo on the right is just a modern day street view photo. They look completely different. You can tell I got a bit of a paint job done over the years. But you can see the roof line is very similar. You can see this very distinct roof line here above, I guess that would be maybe the cupola or so. And then if you take a look at the columns on the porch too, those have pretty much stayed the same as well. So it looks very different, but you can kind of see the clues of where it stayed the same over the years. Next, John George Seabury, a great example of Greek Revival mausoleum. He was born in 1844, also died in 1909. He's actually located just a little bit up the hill from McKim. Seabury came from a prominent family and had planned to be a physician. However, the Civil War interrupted those plans. He served during the Civil War as a private in Company C, 12th New York Volunteer Infantry. After the war in 1873, he founded the Seabury and Johnson Pharmaceutical Company with Robert Wood Johnson. They manufactured medical plasters and surgical dressings. Seabury became the president while Johnson was corporate secretary and sales manager. As their business grew, it moved from Platt Street to South Brooklyn and finally to East Orange, where you can still visit the old Seabury and Johnson buildings at Glenwood Avenue. Today, they're known as the Manufacturers Village. They're actually, the building is still owned by direct descendants of the Seabury family. So if you've driven by on Glenwood Avenue, you know, take a look at history there. Now, Seabury and Johnson by then was a well-respected medical products business known for the quality of their medicated plasters. Johnson hired his brothers to enter the business, and over a number of years, different disagreements occurred. Eventually, his two brothers left to form their own business. Finally, on July 18th, 1885, Robert Wood Johnson left Seabury and Johnson and went to join his brothers at their company, a little startup known as Johnson & Johnson. You may have heard of them, you know. Now, next, Vic and Al Hughes. This is a unique grave in that there are no bodies with it, and these are not real people. This stone was actually put in Rosedale for a filming for a Netflix show. Unfortunately, Rita just informed us today that that show was never actually bought. It was never picked up. So, which makes sense because I was searching high and low on the internet to figure out what show this could have been in, and has not been picked up. So, but it's still at Rosedale, it's still sitting there. But you can tell it's not a real grave if you take a look at the back. This was clearly a grave that a mistake was etched into. I believe it's the birth and death dates got switched up. And so they tried to sand it out, didn't quite work. So obviously the company got this stone at a very deep discount for their production. So just a fun little grave there. Now we're moving on to some more real people here. James and Phebe Crane. Now, if you've taken a tour of the Crane House in historic YWCA, either this photo or the names are going to sound very familiar. The Crane House was built by Israel Crane, who was James's father, in 1796. Israel had a lot of businesses in town, including a general store, textile mill, cider mill, rock quarry, and a toll road. So he was quite wealthy at the time. Eventually, Israel moved to Newark to be closer to his rock quarry in 1840, and at that point he gave the house to his son James and his new wife Phebe. That's actually James and Phebe on their wedding day, looking oh so happy. They could have been happy, you know, photography back then, they had to sit for quite a while, and smiling would have hurt after a while. But there was also a huge age difference. Phebe was about 16 when this photo was taken, when she got married to James, and James was about 30. So there was a big age difference. So maybe that's also the reason they're not quite smiling. Now the stone itself, not that remarkable. Pretty simple, but we always like to include them thanks to the history with the house that we have. This is the house. This is the Crane House in historic YWCA, the one that was built in 1796 and housed James and Phoebe. James and Phoebe lived in this house from about 1840 to about 1900 when Phoebe passed away. And if you're interested, we are offering private tours. You can check out our website, montclairhistory.org, for more information if you'd like. Just had to put that plug in there. Now on to James and Clara Hepburn. Now, no, your computer is not, having bad pixelation. That grave really is almost impossible to read. Really, the only thing legible left on it is Hepburn right at the bottom. Now, we're very glad then that in 1987, a brand new stone was put up that's much more legible and it's going to last a little bit longer than the other one. And I'm going to get into who did that and why in just a second, but I want to give a bit of a background to James and Clara first. Now, James was born in 1815 and died in 1911, and Clara was born in 1818, died in 1906. The couple married in 1840, and by 1859, the couple started missionary work in Japan. Their earliest missionaries to Japan saw their most important work as translating the Bible into Japanese. Hepburn began work on his Japanese English dictionary, and by 1867, he completed and published the first edition. His contributions, in addition to that, included helping introduce Western medicine, starting an English language school that grew into a university, contributing to the first complete Japanese language translation of the Bible, compiling the first Japanese English dictionary, and popularizing the most widely used system of writing Japanese in the Western alphabet, a system that still bears his name today. The 20,000 word dictionary and the romanization known as the Hepburn system, or in Japanese, Hibon, are his most influential accomplishments. Now, a major hurdle for the missionary translators was devising a standardized system for writing Japanese in Roman letters. This group developed a standardized transliteration that Hepburn adopted for the third edition of his dictionary in 1887. The Hepburn system allows an English speaker with little or no knowledge of the language to approximate the Japanese pronunciation. Hepburn is still the standard used for Japanese passports, for signs at airports, railroad facilities, road signs, and in publishing. When he wasn't in Japan, he lived on Glenwood Avenue in Montclair. Now, the stone here was put in by Meiji Gakuin University, which he helped found back in the 19th century. And they put in this brand new stone in honor of him. Now, I'm going to actually bring in a guest speaker right now, Nick Glazewski. He's my partner. We live together, so we're all COVID safe. But he actually went to Meiji Gakuin for a year, studied there during college, learned Japanese, learned to write it, learned to speak it. And so I want to bring him in. He's going to help translate what's on the stone, but he's also going to give a perspective of what the Japanese think of the Hepburns even to this day. So I'm going to bring in Nick Glazewski.
So I started learning Japanese through the Hepburn system in around 2014, and then I spent a year studying at Meiji Gakuin Daigaku in Shinagawa-ku, Tokyo, Japan. So my interaction with Mr. Hepburn, actually, and it's ironic because Erin mentioned this before, the Japanese were more than likely than not going to refer to him as Curtis rather than James. I don't know if it's the way the Japanese think about their languages or how to transliterate Western names. The Japanese also think of him more as a doctor before a Christian missionary. So the reason why he started working his work in Japan was to originally increase the Western understanding of medical knowledge, thought in that. And then the Japanese samurai Bakufu government tried to prevent him from doing that. So he started a college as a side business in his front boardroom, which led to 2 college campuses in Tokyo today. Well, one in Tokyo, one in Yokohama. And because of his contributions through the medical field, the city of Yokohama actually named part of their medical school after him. And also, he was more highly recognized as a doctor and educator before a Christian missionary, to the point of that he was the second foreigner ever awarded the Order of the Rising Sun in 1905 in 3rd class. And just to give you some perspective, there's about 9 classes to that order. So if we could just look at the stone right here. If we look on the right side of the stone, which
That's
okay.
the way you see this.
Yeah. So if you look at the right side of the stone here, you can see his name, which, because of the dictionary they wrote and the transliteration system that he devised, literally translates as James Curtis Hepburn, and then underneath it, it says as derived in the Hepburn system. So if we look at the right, and then do I press the space bar?
Yep.
Thanks. Cool. So then if we look to the left, right, in the center is all the meat that you can see on the other side of the shield. You can see the transliteration for New Jersey. So it's New Jersey, East Orange. So East Orange, New Jersey.
So yeah, the rest of the translation is really what you see on the stone there. We just didn't think we needed to reiterate it, that's all. But if you're interested, the spacing between the red bars is the Japanese, how you write in Japanese, East Orange, New Jersey. So a little fun fact there. And then you can see on the back of the stone, there is a little marker that does say Meiji Gakuen, Tokyo, Japan on the back. So we're very grateful for them, because otherwise the history of Hepburn may have been lost, because that other stone really is illegible. So we're very thankful to Meiji Gakuen for putting in this new stone. All right, oh wait, one more thing. So this is the subway sign. You can just see the Japanese language and then the Hepburn translation at the bottom as well. So last but not least, John Davidson. A fairly simple figure, I should say, but he's great to end with because he wraps up a lot of the stones we saw, the structures, and the people that we talked about today. So he was a perfect ending for today. So his stone, an obelisk, just like we saw a lot of them today, another obelisk. This one also made of zinc or white bronze that we talked about before. The symbolism that you see here, so first off, there's an hourglass on there, the hourglass signifying the inevitable passage of time and the shortness of life. And the wheat bundle, again, which represents, meaning they lived a long and fruitful life. It also denotes immortality and resurrection because of its use as a harvested grain. He actually was in the same company as Captain Dodd that we saw earlier, who died in 1863. And he was in the same unit as James and Phoebe's son, James. Kind of confusion there. We call him James Jr. to make it easier. So he was in the same unit as James Jr. in the Civil War as well. Davidson was a hospital steward. He was non-commissioned staff, 26 New Jersey Infantry. He too fought in the Battle of Fredericksburg, but he mustered out by 1863. Just so you know, a steward is the lowest ranking member of a medical unit. Army regulations on hospital stewards in Civil War include they have to be temperate, honest, and in every way reliable, as well as sufficiently intelligent and skilled in pharmacy. They needed to be temperate because they were distributing medicinal whiskey to the patients, so they couldn't be taking part in that whiskey themselves. They also assisted in surgery, performed medical procedures, and dealt out the day-to-day management of the hospital unit. In addition to Dodd, that unit that Davidson was in lost 14 enlisted men in battle and 21 more to disease. Luckily, Davidson ended up living a pretty long life. He was born in 1821 and died in 1894. So he ended up living another 31 years after he mustered out in the Civil War. So hence the wheat, hence the wheat. So he lived a long and nice, fruitful life. Now that kind of ends my talk here. I just want to give a little bit of information on the Rosedale Cemetery itself. They are located at 408 Orange Road. I think their hours are basically, if you just want to explore the cemetery itself, is sunrise to sunset. However, their office hours are listed below. I would definitely email or call in advance, though, before you check them out. But if you need any help finding anybody or just need some more information, they are happy to help. So I'm going to exit my screen now and be good to go.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
So you had a couple of comments and questions in the chat room. Betty was asking if you could show the location of the graves again on the map.
Oh, the 1906 one?
Right. Well, you're doing that. I will pop in. The one other question from Carrie is, she loved the story about how the polished spear magically turns.
Right. I love that one. If I ever get out to Ohio, I'm going to check that out for sure.
If we ever can travel again.
I know. All right, let me share my screen real quick. Okay, so yes, so this is the old section down here, which is where we were focusing on today. For the most part, just for kind of reference, I believe we were kind of mostly in this area specifically. So if that helps.
Erin, just show where you would go in.
Oh, good question. Okay, so of course I'm kind of guesstimating.
Sort of like the A in Montclair. Is that right?
There we go.
Rita?
Yep, I like that. I think, or the L. Could be the A or the L.
So somewhere there. So you kind of wind through past the chapel, past right, there you go.
Yeah, the
Following
chapel
that,
would be here. Yeah.
following the white road, I
Yeah.
think it is. There's a white line in the road, and you just
Yeah.
follow that all the way through out to the other side. And where that N is, there is the old gatehouse that used to be the way into the cemetery, but that's now closed.
Yeah.
That help, Betty?
Yes, that the Presbyterian Church on Main Street in Orange, where that cemetery is there a link here somehow?
Joseph Fagan, who has a lot of research on that, the people that are buried there, is going to do a history at home coming up.
Oh,
Jane,
great.
the name of that church now is the First Shiloh Church.
Ah, you're on. Great.
And yeah, and to answer Betty's question, there's not a connection between the two graveyards. However, I believe Erin probably mentioned it earlier that when Rosedale opened, or when in 1926, certainly years earlier. But the interesting thing about the Orange graveyard is that the graveyard dates to 1723, but the church was only built in 1926. And when they built the church, they moved a lot of the graves over to Rosedale. And I think in 1850s, maybe, that's when they started moving a lot of graves over to Rosedale. So there's no connection between the two, only in the sense that the graves were moved from one location to another.
So Betty?
You may not be able to answer this, Erin, but I was just wondering, Hepburn's influence, his Christian influence at that time in Japan. Did you run across any information?
Actually,
Because I don't think Christianity has really been able to penetrate the Japanese society. Do you have any views on that?
great question, actually. Nick actually took a little bit of a dig into this afternoon. So you're asking the great question. So I'll let him take it away. Yeah.
So Christianity in Japan is a very interesting thing. Historically, up until about 1868, Christian mercenaries were prosecuted by the Japanese authorities because they saw the Christian faith as being potentially dangerous to the overall Japanese society. I could go into more detail, but
Right.
So from 1868 onward, with the opening of Japan, well, the formal opening of the Japan and the fall of the samurai, Christian missionaries were present in Japan, but it wasn't a full wide adoption like we see in forgive me, but like in Central America,
Or even some African countries.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And to this day, I mean, I have to say, you haven't lived until you listen to a full Protestant mass in full Japanese. That's part of the requirement for attending Meiji Gakuin, because it's a liberal art. It's a private liberal Japanese Catholic school, which is one of a kind. You get very rare. And anecdotally, when I was in Japan, I went to school with a very Protestant young woman, and she had a very hard time finding a congregation to attend in Tokyo, which is a city of 13 million people. She had to go to Yokohama to find a full Japanese, full English / Japanese mass every Sunday.
Right.
So Japanese still are very traditional Shintoists or Buddhists.
Yeah.
But
I hope that answers your question.
sorry.
Yeah. I was there in 2003, and I found that they liked the value system that we have, but not necessarily subscribe to the religious institutions.
Exactly.
And that falls more in line with just the way Shintoism might be, right? Because
Yeah.
of the values and how you apply the values rather than, so
Right.
just really interesting topic. If you want to get with me offline just to talk about anecdotal experiences.
Yeah, it would really be interesting to share my experience with your knowledge. Yeah.
So,
Feel free to shoot me an email, Betty. I think you have my email, but yeah.
Okay, I do. Thank you.
so much.
If anybody else needs my email, it is erin@montclairhistory.org. So feel free, if you have any thoughts, you want to share any stories, feel free to shoot me an email or get connected with Nick, who, as you can tell, loves talking about his experience. So.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. Rita, thank you once again. And Rosedale Cemetery is now one of our newest corporate sponsors, so we thank them for that as well. And I would love to see you guys in person someday at a Rosedale Cemetery tour, maybe in the spring.
Sure.
We're hoping. Okay.
That's
Take care, everybody. And
Okay,
thank
take
you.
care.
Thank you, Erin. Beautiful job.
Thank you.
Yeah, great job, Erin.
Thank you.